dead. Where I could stand in the middle of Fifth Avenue and shoot somebody and I wouldn't lose any voters, okay?
The women with the least likelihood of getting pregnant are the ones most worried about having abortions.
On January 6th of 2021, you had tens of thousands of people peacefully protesting. So, it's not a right-wing conspiracy theory. It's not QAnon. It's real.
Hey folks, welcome back to the Enemies List podcast. My name is Rick Wilson. I am, as always, your host. I am joined today by the great Nigel Hamilton. He is an author, scholar, historian, biographer, and a man with a tremendous new book that I really recommend. It comes out November 5th. It's called Lincoln versus Davis, The War of the Presidents. As you know, on this podcast, we tend to dive into some historical rabbit holes from time to time, but I found this to be fascinating because it is a study of a absolutely unique moment in American history. It's the only time when the country was divided into two warring countries and two presidents went to war, Abraham Lincoln and Jefferson Davis. So, Nigel Hamilton, welcome to the podcast. And I wanted to start out by asking you, this is a study, this is, as you put it, a partial biography, a semi-biography of these two men, because it really is in this window of their lives during the war. Talk to me about the personalities and the psychology of these two men and how that shaped the Civil War itself.
Well, Rick, the first thing I think I'd say is that Lincoln, when he became president, by virtue of the United States Constitution, became commander-in-chief. And the problem was that Lincoln really had no real military experience to speak of. And he found himself up against a guy who, although he was the same age, came from the same state, who'd left on the same day by train to his own inauguration, was a soldier, a trained soldier who'd been to West Point, who'd served as a young infantry officer, who'd distinguished himself in the Mexican War, who'd become United States Secretary of War, who was a general when he was appointed to become president of the Confederate States. So Lincoln, I don't think, really recognized what he was up against when he became the 16th president of the United States.
And yet, from the beginning, this was always a war where the North, if it became engaged in putting its industrial and human capital to work, was going to outgun, both literally and metaphorically, the South. But Davis managed to continue for a very long time to out of I guess cohesion and military skill to put Lincoln and the North under tremendous pressure.
Yeah, I mean, that was the thing which most interested me, because I'm really a 20th century military historian, and I've spent the larger part of my life looking at generals and presidents in that century. But I thought that I could use the lens that I developed on Franklin Roosevelt in World War II in a trilogy that I wrote. I thought I could use that lens to look at how Abraham Lincoln had operated, had donned that mantle, that necessary mantle of command in an earlier century. And yes, on paper, the North completely should have overpowered the South. But the United States was a vast territory. And what I think Jefferson Davis, as really a born soldier, understood was that he didn't really have to do very much. He had to secure his borders as best he could.
Hmm.
And I think that's where many historians have misunderstood the story of the fall of Fort Sumter, because people assume that that was a kind of symbolic gesture that the people of South Carolina and Charleston, wanted their fortress back in the middle of the Ashley River. But actually, Jefferson Davis was thinking strategically. He was thinking of the East Coast. He was thinking of these great fortresses all the way down the East Coast
Hmm.
and on the Gulf. And his idea was you defend your soil
Hmm.
and uh, you wait for the enemy to invade you. Well,
Right.
I know from World War II, Hitler, in a sense, only had to draw this ring around the Third Reich, and it made it extremely difficult for the Allies, the United States and Britain and Canada, to invade amphibiously and to overcome, a far smaller country. So that was the problem for Abraham Lincoln, and that was the advantage which Jefferson Davis held.
Hmm. Hmm. So, from your description, from a lot of readings, we understand that Lincoln was not terribly well served by his cabinet, and by his generals in the beginning of the Civil War. Talk to us a little bit about how the contrast between the Lincoln, or maybe not the contrast, but the aspect of Lincoln being saddled with McClellan, who he did not who he did not love, and who was not particularly striking all the marks in the beginning, and this idea that Jefferson Davis seemed to have a more cohesive um, team, I guess.
Yes, I think the word team is perfectly appropriate. It's just that I would question whether Lincoln was saddled with General McClellan. Lincoln becomes president, um, is inaugurated in March of 1861, and he has a very experienced, probably the most famous soldier in America at the time, Winfield Scott, who was the general in chief. But General Scott is elderly. He's 74. He's suffering from gout. And his view is that the North possesses this vast, as you put it, industrial advantage, and therefore, in a sense, just had to squeeze the adversary dry. It was called the Anaconda Plan.
Anaconda, right,
Yeah.
right.
That he just had to blockade the South, and the South would eventually fall. And but Lincoln was anxious for a number of reasons. After all, he hadn't actually been elected by a full majority,
Mhm.
just by a plurality, and he wanted to hold the support of the northern states, and he felt that he couldn't ask them to wait out necessarily a long war. So he insisted that the North invade the South, which of course is exactly what Jefferson Davis wanted.
Mhm.
And so he had an argument with Winfield Scott about it. Lincoln insisted. He'd called up 75,000 troops to augment a tiny United States army at the time, only 13,000 men.
Mhm.
And um, and Scott was very unsure about whether you could put completely green troops into battle and advance on Richmond, which was the
Mhm.
second Confederate capital, Montgomery the first. And so Scott tried to persuade the president not to go ahead with it, but Lincoln insisted. And the Battle of Bull Run is really the kind of turning point at the beginning of the war because
Hmm.
Jefferson Davis had um, received into the South a huge number of, I mean, hundreds of senior officers who'd been trained and had become
Hmm.
experienced as United States officers. So he had younger, more dynamic officers to command his troops, men like Pierre Beauregard, uh,
Hmm.
General Joe Johnston, and of course, Robert E. Lee.
Right.
So he had that advantage. And when push came to shove, I think Jefferson Davis is most underrated as a general. I mean, he had this plan, strategic plan for that first battle to use trains. It's the first battle in
Hmm.
history in
And
which
it
trains are
was
used.
decisive at Bull Run. By deploying troops by train was a major factor in that.
Absolutely, because he
Yeah.
basically had two armies and he could use his left-wing army from the Blue Ridge Mountains to
Hmm.
bring them secretly by train and reinforce his main army under Beauregard at the appropriate moment. But again, Jefferson Davis's brilliance at that time was to wait until the enemy actually attacked. Once it did, and he was positive that that was the main force ahead of him, he could send a telegram to General Johnston around Winchester, and they were brought by train. In fact, Jefferson Davis, I think, is the first general in history to have traveled onto the battlefield, active battlefield, by train. Now, you mentioned McClellan. It was the disaster at Bull Run that caused the North really to panic, really, and it was people were worried that Washington would be overrun by Southern troops. And at that point, Lincoln began to lose confidence in General
Right.
Scott and blamed him, which is, I think, as a historian, was probably a little unfair. But at any rate, people had talked about this young 34-year-old
Right.
who was a railway executive. And,
Hmm.
he had some small experience in the Mexican War, but I don't think of any actual combat. And it beats me today and many fellow historians as to why Lincoln could possibly have promoted an inexperienced 34-year-old not only to command the main United States Army, but to take Winfield Scott's place as general in chief of all the Union armies. Uh, and worse than that was that McClellan was incredibly arrogant for a 34-year-old. And the moment he is appointed, he refuses to talk to the commander in chief or to tell him what his plan is. So, from the time that he is appointed, at the beginning, really the end of October of 1861 until the
Hmm.
following spring, this new general in chief does absolutely nothing. I
Hmm.
mean, he's a pro-slaver and he falls ill, but he won't accept any instructions or orders from the
Direction. Right.
yeah. So I I just object to not object, but I question whether you can say Lincoln was saddled with him.
Mm.
Lincoln saddled himself with this young man
Got
because
it.
the terrible thing is, Lincoln is really one of the great figures of history for a number of
No
reasons.
question.
But one of them is that he was such a nice man. And having appointed this 34-year-old, he didn't quite have the gumption. I mean, the young man came from a good family in the Midwest, and whereas Lincoln came from, a
Nothing.
pioneer family, and
Hmm.
Lincoln couldn't always had a problem in terms of conflict with human beings, with the fellow especially with subordinates, he just couldn't fire him. So, yes, he was saddled with him, but he had saddled himself with him, I think is honestly fair to say. So, unfortunately, once McClellan insisted on his own plan to defeat the South, the North was really doomed.
So talk to us about, I mean, McClellan goes into the field finally in 1862, and basically that eastern flanking, army of or the sort of peninsula campaign. As that starts to develop, Lincoln is starting in my read to sort of come into his own a little more as president and feel a little more confident in his, or at least a little more assertive in his role as president. But he still wasn't getting completely what he needed out of a military campaign against the South. It still wasn't breaking the will of the South. The anaconda was there, but it wasn't cutting them off completely. We were still in a position where Davis didn't feel like he was out of options yet by any means. Talk to us about how the two men, as you get into the middle of the war and as the war starts to escalate with this terrible cost. Because, I mean, let's remember, the first Battle of Bull Run, people were coming out in their carriages from Washington, D.C. to watch it like a sporting event.
Exactly.
But it became a much bloodier and much more costly effort by 1862, 1863. Talk to us a little bit about where Lincoln's psychology and Davis's psychology was changing as the war became less sort of strategic chess moves and more bloody, in-your-face battles.
Well, I think the problem for Lincoln was first that he couldn't bring himself to fire the man he'd made his general in chief. He did reduce him from general in chief to just the commander of the Army of the Potomac. That was the biggest army of the United States, and because he had failed to sort of rein in the twerp, as I think of him, really, little twerp, McClellan had been able to take really the largest United States Army in its history by sea around to the
Mm-hmm.
around the peninsula to the James River, really south of Richmond.
Right.
And that is, in a sense, in my view, I suppose, as a 20th century historian, that's America's Gallipoli. I mean,
Sure.
because
Yeah.
that army is beaten in battle in the Battle of the 7 Days, is forced to retire, to retreat,
Mm-hmm.
retreats to this tiny little spit of land on the James River, which you can still visit today,
Sure.
Harrison's Landing.
Harrison's Landing. I've been there.
Yeah. And Lincoln, like you say, is beginning to realize that he has to think out not just general strategy, but tactical strategy as well, because the men he's appointed are not performing well enough. They're not standing up well enough to their Southern counterparts. So, to his credit, Lincoln, for the first time in the war, in the summer of '62, actually gets on a boat, a paddle steamer, and goes to Harrison's Landing, and insists on actually meeting McClellan on the battlefield.
There's that famous Brady photograph of the two of them in the meeting.
Well, no, that meeting is a little bit later.
Oh, is it? I thought that was okay. Never mind.
No, that's just before
you, sir, are the expert.
Yeah, but I did include in the book a picture of Lincoln actually reviewing the troops, in this tiny little, bottled up army position on. I think of it, of course, as an expert as Dunkirk, and
Right.
Lincoln goes there and wants to persuade, just as Churchill had to decide to evacuate the British armies in 1940, Lincoln had to decide whether to withdraw this, huge army of 130,000 men and bring it back to defend Washington. And once again, you see him, he can see mentally because he's so smart, but he hasn't quite got the kind of executive authority in his personality to order McClellan to evacuate the army. And that's when the greatest tragedy in a way of the Civil War takes place, because McClellan sits on at this landing for weeks after weeks. The men are suffering from dysentery and malaria and whatever it is.
Hmm.
And McClellan refuses to move them. And Lincoln comes back to Washington, but he and sends telegrams saying, shouldn't you withdraw? But he cannot force it. He can't bring himself to give him a
Hmm.
direct order. And once Jefferson Davis realizes that the Union Army is stuck on that river, he has a chance to actually go uh, for Washington, his enemy's capital.
Right.
And but to me, that's in a sense the most interesting example of the way that history doesn't always move as in a predictable way, because by then Jefferson Davis had appointed Robert E. Lee as his main commander,
Hmm.
field commander, and that was a great appointment. But he perhaps underestimates how behind this sort of gentlemanly exterior of the kind of noble officer, Robert E. Lee is uh, an extremely ambitious and
Sure.
cold, calculating commander. And Lee decides he will not just take this opportunity while McClellan is stuck on the James River to go for Washington. He doesn't want to get stuck in the suburbs of Washington or the
Hmm.
city itself. He will invade the North and encircle Washington and go up
Correct.
through Maryland, a loyal
Hmm.
state, into Philadelphia, and encircle Washington from the north. And
Right.
that, to me, me is the most extraordinary moment in the history of the war when Robert E. Lee, who's a brilliant field commander, but an absolutely hopeless politician,
Right.
uh, fends off Davis, who tries to pursue him by horse to say, wait, 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 let's think about this before we invade the North, And Lee invades the North and stupidly, I think one of the great blunders of the war, issues this proclamation to the people of Maryland, basically
Right.
telling them to surrender or die. And
Hmm.
that is when President Lincoln, who has perseverated and procrastinated and vacillated for almost 2 years of war, sees an opening that he can
Hmm.
actually use this mistake by his enemy and can issue his own proclamation.
That,
And
yeah.
that becomes the Emancipation Proclamation,
Hmm.
because both presidents have, until that moment, basically swept slavery under the rug. That's a phrase that was used by uh, James McPherson, the great Civil War
Hmm.
historian. And I think, and it's exactly right. The two presidents had basically pretended until that moment that the war wasn't about slavery. It was only about
Right.
the integrity of the United States as a single
Hmm.
country. And finally, everybody around Lincoln is trying to tell him that actually that slavery is the real point, that you
Hmm.
cannot allow an enemy, a rebel so-called country of only 5.5 million people, to use 3.5 million
Right.
enslaved people to feed and fund, because of the value they represent,
Sure.
an armed insurrection against the United States.
Hmm.
Why would you conceal that? Why would you pretend that wasn't right in both domestically and in front of foreign countries? And yet
Right.
Lincoln's, I mean, one of the McClellan is definitely a bad boy in my book, but but uh, but another one is William Seward, the Secretary of State, who forbids his diplomats in Europe from ever mentioning slavery.
Right.
I mean,
Right.
it's mind-boggling in retrospect because that allowed President Davis to uh, frame the war just as an enemy invading the sacred soil of the southern states. And
And
yeah,
it's still their ability to elide that issue or deny it or whatever, however you want to phrase it. I mean, look, the all the northern states had from 1777 to 1810, maybe something like that. Every northern state had gotten rid of slavery by that point, or had a process for its unwinding, dismantlement, elimination, abolition, however you want to phrase it. They were all slightly different approaches, and no southern state ever had. And yet it was always it does strike me as something very unusual that they managed to keep this for the first couple of years without saying the words outright, that this is a war about a grotesque human abuse that has to end. And 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 it's ironic to me that the the whole lost cause culture that even exists today tries to pretend it wasn't about slavery. It was
mm,
always about slavery.
yeah. Well, as Lincoln himself said in his second inaugural, it had always been. But of course, Lincoln himself was partly responsible for that sweeping under the rug because he did have this general in 1861, John Fremont, the famous pathfinder, who um, uh, had asserted martial law in Missouri and had issued a proclamation freeing all enslaved people who were being forced to work um, for insurrectionists. And I think that's the thing which hasn't perhaps been brought out enough by historians of the Civil War till now, is that it wasn't just that slavery was immoral. I
Right.
mean, like you say, everybody in the world knew it was immoral, really. I mean, even the Russians had had
Right.
freed their serfs in 1861,
Right.
virtually on the same day as Lincoln was inaugurated. Um, Everyone knew that it was, immoral in a human sense. It was just that how could you allow a number of states in the South to claim that they didn't accept the election that had taken place
Right.
uh, according to the Constitution and fairly in 1861, who'd
Hmm.
failed to accept that, who states which had then decided to secede and pursue a course of armed insurrection. How could you allow them to use 3.5 million people, enslaved people, to fund your insurrection? I mean, the truth is, the Confederacy wouldn't have lasted 5 minutes,
Correct.
metaphorically speaking, if it hadn't been for those people feeding them and providing the credit, because every enslaved person was worth at least $1,000. And that was the credit the Confederacy was using in Europe, in the very place where Secretary Seward was forbidding his diplomats to mention the word. I mean,
And yet it's viewed as one of Lincoln's most important legacies. What was the reaction in Davis's orbit and from Davis himself when the proclamation was issued? I'm very curious how your history on that.
well, the climax of my book is when Lincoln decides that he has to make slavery um, a a casus belli, a reason, a new actual reason for the war. Um, and so the book really ends with him uh, putting that Emancipation Proclamation into effect. It gave the South 3 months warning to stand down, or else all enslaved people would be forever free after that. Basically, because they would not be allowed to be used to fund and feed an armed insurrection against the United States one day longer.
And it really did cut off Europe. I mean, some of the
Absolutely.
nations that were
They were
France
on
in
the
particular. Yeah,
Oh, yes, absolutely, Rick. The European nations, and I'm originally British, including Britain, were on the
right.
very point of recognizing the Confederacy because the Confederacy was doing so well on the battlefield.
Hmm.
So they were able to, the senior, more aristocratic politicians in Britain were able to say, wow, old boy, those chaps are doing frightfully well on the battlefield. And um, there's no, we need the cotton.
Yeah,
So,
they did need the cotton.
so they, I don't mean to be facetious, but
No, yeah,
they really were on the point of recognizing the Confederacy as a sovereign, independent country, new country. And the moment uh, Lincoln issued his Emancipation Proclamation, that avenue was closed off because, as you were saying earlier, no country in the world, actually uh, permitted slavery anymore. Certainly none of the major countries in the world. And so neither France nor Britain nor Austria, any of the Spain, any of the European countries could, once it was out in the open, once it had been brought out from under the carpet, none of those European powers could possibly openly recognize a country that was fighting for slavery against Lincoln. And the
right.
greatest thing of all was that Lincoln who was a lawyer,
Hmm.
he'd always resisted. He'd always been under pressure to advance emancipation, but he'd always resisted because he was afraid of the Supreme Court, and with
Right.
probably with good reason. He thought it would be struck down by the Supreme Court if he did. But you see, he realized then that the enemy had attacked the United States. This was like Pearl Harbor.
Hmm. Hmm. But
He-
it strikes me though that 6 months after the Emancipation Proclamation, we have the Battle of Gettysburg,
Mm.
and the war turns on its head. At that point, that hinge of history twists the in the direction of the Union. And how did the sort of headspaces and look horrifying at a horrifying cost, obviously. How did the headspaces, sort of the perspective of the war of Lincoln and Jefferson, change in that moment?
Well, that sort of follows where my book ends, but the, towards the end of the book, when Lincoln announces the what's called the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation, giving the South the 3 months um, to stand down, it's most interesting that Jefferson Davis was completely stunned, and so was the
Right.
Confederate Congress. Um, it was like they just hadn't expected it. And the brilliance is that Lincoln issued the proclamation as a military necessity. In other words,
Right.
there was
Yes.
nothing.
Yes.
You couldn't go to the Supreme Court and say, "Oh, this is completely wrong." In terms of legal justice, this was a military decision under martial law, so to speak, um, and that left Jefferson Davis and the Southern leaders with only one possibility: to try and fight it out. Like you say, they did at Gettysburg, at these Chancellorsville, these terrible battles. But after all, we saw this in the Second World War. Once the American and British and Canadian armies landed at D-Day and were successful, Hitler
Hmm.
was lost. I
Right.
mean,
It was over. It just didn't.
yes, but gosh, the Germans did go on fighting for virtually a whole year
Hmm.
thereafter with
Hmm.
vast numbers of deaths. So it didn't. Lincoln's proclamation didn't end the war, but it doomed the Confederacy. There wasn't anything they could do except hope that they could somehow battle their way back and force the North
Hmm.
to compromise. Just as, we'll never forget the Battle of the Bulge in the Second World War,
Sure.
when Hitler launches, 28 divisions to try
Through
and,
almost everything they had in the Western uh, uh, front to
yeah.
against them. It is that you end the book with the Emancipation Proclamation essentially, and it sort of goes off like a bomb inside the Confederacy.
Yeah.
Um, and I do hope you write a second volume of this, because this is I love this because it was an insight into these two men, and I'm not a fan of Jefferson Davis, but it was a more nuanced portrait of Davis than a lot of people I think have read, and a more interesting insight into his cleverness. I mean, he was not a this was not a dumb man. This was a
No,
sly, careful, crafty, strategic guy, on the wrong side of history.
well put. Yeah.
So, well, I want to thank you so much today for coming on the show, Nigel. It has been tremendous. This is a fantastic book, folks. If you are a history nerd like me, or if you are interested in reading about leadership at a level that I think is compelling and fascinating, about two of the most consequential figures in American history, Lincoln versus Davis, War of the Presidents by Nigel Hamilton, is absolutely fantastic. It is coming out on November the 5th, and I highly recommend it. Thank you so much again, Nigel, for joining us today, and we will talk to you again soon.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you.